So in this session, we're going to be looking at how to use loops and arrays. Now, loops and arrays are very closely linked together, and it's almost certain that if you've an exam question or some code that needs to use arrays, then you'll be using loops as well. Okay, so these marry up absolutely beautifully. So we're going to look at how to use loops with arrays. Now, to begin with, let's just recap how we update a value inside an array. So here I've got my array numbers. Okay, it's got some values in there. And then I'm taking a single index, so index 0 in this case, and I'm taking that index again, so the value that's in index 0 in this array, and adding 1 to it. Okay, so that will take this number 10, add 1 to it to become 11. So index 0 will have the value of 11 instead of 10. So if I run that and maybe put a print on it as well, so print numbers out, we should see the value 11 in index 0. And there we go. So we're going to look at how we can use loops to maybe do something with every item in the list, because it's not often we just want to change a single value in a list or use a single value in a list. It's very common in computer science that we want to iterate over every single value in the array. So here I've got a command called len. Now you might be familiar with len already if you've used it with strings before. So what len will do is it will count the number of items in the array. So if I run this, you'll see it gives me the value of 5. So there's 5 numbers in this array, so I get the value of 5. So len is actually really useful because we'll end up using it in our loops. So let's start looking at the loop structure. Now, we're going to be using a counter-controlled loop. Now, we've gone through counter-controlled loops before. If you can't remember, this is a loop that basically runs a predictable number of times. We know it's predictable for arrays because we know how many items are in the array. Okay, so it's predictable. We want to look at each item. So the first index is index 0. Now, that's the reason why I've got a variable called start and set its value 0, because the first index 0. The end, I'm going to put as the length of numbers. Now, this actually won't necessarily always work. So I'll show you an example of why this won't necessarily work. So I've put my equals in there, and I'm going to run this code. You can see it says start is 0 and end is 5. That's got index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. However, the last number's wrong because, think about it, I've got 5 numbers. The last index for value 6 is not 5, it's actually 4 because it's 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that will go over the length of my list, which is wrong. So a couple of ways I can fix that. I can put a -1 there. Okay, that will fix it. Or I can get rid of this equal sign. Okay, long short of it, I want this loop to go 1 less, essentially. So let's look at a loop to actually do this. Now, I've kind of cut down this loop a little bit, so I'm going to use one variable just to make it a bit neater. So I've got a variable x, which starts at index 0, and it's going up to len numbers. So notice that I've omitted the equals because I want to stop at index 4 and not index 5. And then I'm basically adding 1 to the index. Now this code won't necessarily work as we want it to, because I want to add 1 to every single number. So 11 becomes 12, 9 becomes 10, so on and so forth. So if I run this code, you'll notice that the first index suddenly becomes 16 and all the other indexes are unchanged. The reason for that is because this index is always the same. Okay, so every time this loop runs, it always uses index 0, which is obviously not correct. This is not what we want to do. So there's a couple of golden rules when dealing with loops and arrays. First of all, you need a counter-controlled loop, which starts at 0 and goes to the end of the array. Okay, so that's what we've already set up. The second is when we want to use the array, either to update it or to use it for something else, we must use the counter, the variable I'm using, to keep track of where I am in the loop. So here I've got numbers x equals numbers x plus 1. So if I run that, you'll see that these numbers have now all been updated by 1. So 16 becomes 17, 9 becomes 10, and so on and so forth. So what's happened? Well, we start index 0. We get the value of index 0 out, which is 16. We add 1 to it to become 17, and we update that position, so that becomes 17. We add 1 to x, so x is now 1, and we repeat, we loop. So at index 1, which is going to be the value of 9 this time, we add 1 to it, becomes 10, and then we reassign index 1 to be 10, which is why that has changed. And that will loop through all the way through. So let's look at some other ways you can iterate over a loop. So we've already kind of looked at the first one, so I've just included it again just to kind of recap. So here I've got my array numbers, and then I've got a loop which iterates over it. It's starting at index 0, ending at the length of the array -1. Notice it's going to be -1 because of the lack of equals there, so it's going to stop at the last index and not the length of the list. So that's kind of common. So I'm going to run this code, and you can see it says next number is 10, and it's going to print out in order. There is another type of loop in Python. Now, for those of you studying GCSE and A-level, in pseudocode, you must not use this technique. Okay, this is a Python thing. It's not a pseudocode thing. There is a for loop in pseudocode for the exam, which is completely different to this. Okay, so I include it because if you go on the internet, you'll see this used a lot because it's just a quicker way of looping over an array. Okay, so what happens is numbers is my array, and then it says for n in numbers. So n becomes and the actual value of this array. So let's run this. You can see I get the exact same output. So the first time it loops, okay, n gets a value of 10. So it gets the first value in the array. It then iterates over to the next one and then becomes the second value, then the third, and so on and so forth. So n actually gets assigned a value. So it's as if someone has gone like this. Actually, let's go to this loop here. It's as if someone's done this. X equals numbers x, and then instead of going like that, someone's just done n like that. Okay, so it's that kind of thing. And also the for loop, you notice that you don't have to put x equals x plus 1. You don't have to specify start and end points. You can see why this is a quick way of just looping over an array. However, it's not perfect because you don't necessarily have as much control over it as you would do with a normal while loop. It has its main uses, but it's not perfect. And sometimes you may use a while loop. So I will be focusing mainly on while loops in my examples, but I just wanted to introduce that for those people who want to use it. So if I want to maybe go backwards over an array, so I'm starting at the last index and go to the first, I will just need to use a reverse counter-controlled loop. So we've studied this already. So I'm starting at the length of the array -1. Remember, the last index is always the length -1. And then I'm stopping at 0, but I want to include 0 because 0 is the first index. And instead of adding 1, I'm subtracting 1. So if I run that, you can see you got the numbers in reverse. And let's do numbers x now, and that should give us the values in the array just backwards. One last thing about the for loop. So if you remember, when it does it, n becomes the first value, then n becomes the second value. If I try and change n inside the loop, it does not impact the original array. Now, I'm introducing this as a little side point purely because this might throw you. Maybe it won't, I don't know. So if I run that, you can see my array remains unchanged because I've changed this variable n, but I've not actually updated the array. Okay, so again, that's one of the limitations of using a for loop in that way. So the practice task to have a go at, again, try the task, code it, but if you get stuck, then come back because there will be a model answer after this slide, but do try it first before you go straight to the model answer. So what I want you to do is, here's an array called numbers, and it's got some values inside it already. I want you to add up all those numbers and display the total. Now, I want you to do that using a loop. So not just simply doing your head and then writing the answer out, because that's cheating, isn't it? I want you to loop through it and update this variable total. Okay, so I've given you a variable total which you will need in this loop, and I've given you a counter to use within your loop called x. So you need a counter controlled loop. You need to update total with and add the current value of total plus the array value. And then at the end of the loop, display the answer. Okay, so have a go with that. Again, if you get stuck, you can't do it, do try anyway. But if you get completely stuck, look at the model answer on the next slide. So here's the model answer. Now I'm fully aware that this could be done using a for loop as well. I am using a while loop because I just think it's easier to kind of just learn it through from while loops first, because you've got a lot more flexibility with it, and also it won't confuse you when it comes to doing the exam, because you're not allowed to use Python for loops in the exam. Okay, I know it's a bit irritating, but that's the way it is. So what we've done is we've got a counter controlled loop. Okay, so a standard bog standard counter controlled loop. One of the beautiful things about using counter control loops and arrays is that the counter control loop code is always the same. Okay, it does not change unless you are kind of going in reverse order or do something weird and wacky. If you're simply starting at the first index and go all the way to the end of the array, then the code is always going to be starting at 0, going till the length of the array, and you're having x equals x plus 1. Okay, so it's dead easy. The bit that you might have thrown you is how do we keep a running total as we're going through the array, and that's what this line total equals totals plus numbers x does. So what it does is it takes the current total, okay, it adds onto it the a value in the array. So x starts off as being 0, so it takes a value of 10, stores it into total. X gets added 1, so x is now 1. It then takes the value of 9, so total currently has the value of 10 because we've already added 10 to it. We add another 9 to it because of numbers x, or numbers 1, which is going to be index 1, which is 9. So 10 plus 9 becomes 19. And then we move on to the next index, add the 8 on, and so on and so forth to get the full answer. So that's how you write code to do running total. And this code template, if you want to call it, or code pattern is how I prefer to refer to it, is something that you'll make use of a lot. Okay, so you can adapt this for many other little coding patterns, and it's a very useful one to know.